Hello and welcome to the next episode of my tutorial series, Keyboard and Theory Basics on Synthesizers. So let's recap a little. So far we've covered various types of improvisation, we've named all the keys, we've described the circle of fifths, we've described the chords and their degrees in the scale and their inversions, we've talked about how to improvise based on voice leading or voice motions. Today we're going to talk about a topic which I think is usually described as being more advanced and is often described in a very complicated manner. And that topic is modal borrowing. So what is modal borrowing firstly? Well, first and foremost, modal borrowing is borrowing of chords or notes from another mode. Now, we've described the modes with respect to the circle of fifths. In particular, ranging from brighter to darker notes being included with respect to the root. The common hierarchy used to describe these is a set of esoteric names, but the brightest would be called the Lydian, followed by the Ionian, which is also the major scale, followed by the Mixolydian, then the Dorian, then the Aeolian, which is also known as the minor scale, the Phrygian, and then the Locrian. And the way that we've learnt to construct these is we know or we remember the major scales and we simply add sharps or flats to convert that scale into one of the other scales. So specifically, if we start with a major scale, let's say C major, if we add one sharp, we reach the Lydian mode, the brightest mode. If we add one flat, we make the scale a little darker. This is the Mixolydian mode. So you can think in the hierarchy of brightness to darkness that the Ionian mode, or the major scale, is flanked on either sides by the Lydian mode and the Mixolydian mode, representing a brighter and a darker variant on that scale. So when we talk about modal borrowing, we talk about borrowing typically from the most closely related scales. So in this case, if we were borrowing notes from another mode in the major scale, we would probably borrow from the Lydian or the Mixolydian. Correspondingly, if we were in the minor scale, so that was a C minor scale, we might choose to add a sharp to that, which is corresponding to removing a flat. So instead of the Aeolian or minor scale, we would move to the Dorian. So instead of, we would go. So that is a brighter scale, and the darker scale, by adding an additional flat, we go from the Aeolian to the Phrygian. So again, if we were in the minor scale, we would consider borrowing from the Dorian or the Phrygian, a little bit brighter or a little bit darker. So what does it mean to borrow? Well, borrowing in this context means using notes or chords from those scales. Most commonly, I would say, it is used in reference to borrowing chords. Let's have a little think here, because there's another something you might have noticed. If you remember, I described that we can construct pentatonics from the circle of fifths in the same way as we can construct 7-note scales from the circle of fifths. So the way that we do this is, if we want to convert a 7-note scale to a pentatonic scale, we move the note on the circle of fifths furthest in the clockwise and counterclockwise direction. So you might ask yourself, well, how do I know which notes those are? The easiest way to know which notes those are is, whatever your key signature is, if you add a sharp to it, you've now eliminated, if you imagine the note that was removed, it is the most flat note. And if you add a flat to it, you've eliminated the most sharp note, so to speak. So let me just show this more specifically. So let's go back to C major. So if we were to add a sharp, what sharp would it be? Well, the key signature is 0 sharps. So the first sharp we always add is F sharp. So if we added an F sharp, then we can imagine that that must be the F, which became the F sharp, was eliminated from that scale. So the F is at one end of the arc of these 7 notes. If we added a flat, what would it be? It would be B flat. So B is at the other end of that arc. You will notice B and F are the 2 notes that we eliminate to make a pentatonic scale. C major pentatonic. That same process actually works in any of the modes. The exceptions being, and there's good reason for this, the Lydian mode and the Locrian mode. Well, why? Let's look at the Lydian mode. C Lydian. 1 sharp. What if I added a second sharp? So now my C, the root of my scale, has just become a C sharp. This is no longer a C scale because there's no C in it. So when you try and remove the end notes from the Lydian scale, you remove the root. So there is no corresponding pentatonic. We understand that there should only be 5 pentatonic modes. Correspondingly, if we make the Locrian scale, you will discover that again the C becomes a B when you try and add an additional flat. You get a C flat coming in, and again the C is lost, so you can't do this conversion on those 2 scales. But for all of the other scales, we can look at what happens if we add a sharp, what happens if we add a flat, and those will be the notes that we eliminate to make a pentatonic scale. So let's do it in C minor. 3 flats. If we were going to add a sharp or remove a flat, which would we remove? Well, we know the flats occur in the order B, E, A. So we're going to remove that note. If we were to add a flat, what would it be? Well, we have B, E, A, D flat. So let's remove the D. Interesting. And this works for all of the modes which actually have corresponding pentatonics. So we simply look at which note would change if we added a sharp, which note would change if we added a flat, and those are the 2 notes that we can eliminate to convert our 7-note scale to a pentatonic. But that has another consequence, and this is quite an interesting consequence. We know that adding a sharp to a scale makes it brighter, adding a flat to a scale makes it darker. So when we have a scale and when we play the pentatonic, the notes that we eliminated from the scale, the notes that we're not playing as part of our pentatonic, are also the notes that will change if we borrow from an adjacent mode. Allow me to illustrate a little more clearly. So let's look at C major again. If we added a sharp, what sharp would it be? F sharp. So you can see this note that we would play would be excluded from the pentatonic, and we would play less frequently if we were playing in the C major scale, has an adjacent key which is from a parallel mode. So let's listen to the diatonics of the C major scale first. So C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished. Now let's look at those notes corresponding to the Lydian mode. C major, D major, E minor, F sharp minor, G major, A minor, B minor. So I don't know if you noticed there, but there are 3 chords which are changed in that sequence of diatonics. In particular, the 3 chords which would have used the F. So you can imagine the F could either be the 3rd note, the 2nd note, or the 1st note. So if we were making a chord progression, we've used this chord progression before. So let's say that we decided we would like to add some flavor to that. Let's say it was actually this. And we didn't like that we had repeated the F chord twice. So we could choose to do a modal borrow. This is a slightly unusual choice because this will convert from F major to F sharp diminished. Nonetheless, so you can hear that we have similar voice leading, we have similar voice motion, but we've introduced a chord which is not a diatonic of the scale that we're in. So that was borrowed in the major key from the Lydian mode. Let's try and borrow from the Mixolydian mode. So the Mixolydian mode would have a B flat. So that is C Mixolydian. So which chords are going to be affected? Well, the B chord is going to be affected, the E chord is going to be affected, and the G chord is going to be affected. How are they affected? Well, the E chord is going to become E diminished. The G chord is going to become G minor. The B diminished chord is going to become B flat major. So, same chord progression, C, F, G, F. But what if we wanted to make it a little bit darker? Well, we know that G, the modal borrow from the Mixolydian scale, is B minor. So let's try. Interesting. Let's try and use the F diminished again. This may be taking it a bit far. Still, relatively interesting. So we have then this vocabulary, this capacity to introduce these 3 additional chords from 2 adjacent modes. Let's try and do the same exercise, but let's use C minor as a starting point here. So the C minor starting point. So what are the diatonics? C minor, D diminished, E major, F minor, G minor, A flat major, B flat major, F minor. So what would change if we wanted to make this brighter or darker a scale? Well, the first option to make it brighter would be to move to the Dorian mode. The Dorian mode, instead of 3 flats, is only going to have 2. So in other words, what changes is the A. So which chords are going to change because of this? The D chord will be different, the F chord will be different, and the A chord will be different. How are they different? So the D chord would have been D diminished, and it becomes D minor. So we have D minor in our vocabulary here. The F chord would have been F minor, becomes F major. The next chord would have been A flat major, and it will become A diminished. This is A minor, A diminished. So interesting. I quite like that the 2 chord, instead of diminished, becomes a minor 2. So imagine I had a chord progression that was going to be 2, a 5, and a 1. Instead of that sequence, I could have chosen 2 with the borrowed D minor chord, the 5 in regular position, and the root 1. So that's a sort of minor 2-5-1, but instead of playing that diminished D, which might sound a little odd, I play a D minor instead. Let's try the other borrowing option here, which is instead of making it brighter by taking away a flat, let's make it darker by adding a flat. What flat do we add? D flat is what we're going to add. So our D chords, all the chords, the diatonics that use the D will be changed. What are those? So the first one would have been the G minor chord, and it's going to become a G diminished chord. The next chord would have been B flat minor, and it's going to become B flat major, and it's going to become B flat minor. And finally, the D chord would have been D diminished, and it's going to become D flat major. D diminished, D flat major. So again, we have another selection of 3 chords that we could choose to use. These chords are useful when you're composing a chord progression. The notes that I've mentioned can also be used directly in an improvisation. So say for example I was improvising in C major. So notice that I went there for that B flat, borrowed from the Lydian mode. Similarly, I borrowed the F sharp from the Lydian mode. So yes, there is a relatively complicated explanation for why you might do this borrowing. And in order to think about which notes to borrow, I like to think about, well, what does the pentatonic look like and what does the 7-note scale look like? And then I can remember the difference between those quite easily and see which notes are coming from which modes. But more usefully, I think, when you're composing, when you're tempted to go for, oh, I'm going to do my 6, 5, 4, 1. It's perfectly reasonable. The 6, the 5, the 4, the 1. But we might choose to turn that 4 into this one. So 6 to 5 to diminished 4, or diminished flat 4, a diminished sharp 4 rather, to the 1. So it's given us a different flavor to work with, but this will still be compatible with the pentatonic. It will have a slightly weaker harmony, the reason being that we've actually now placed the note adjacent to one of the notes in the pentatonic scale. So if I was playing this against an F or against a G, it would sound weaker. So it might be that if you chose to use this chord, you would limit your pentatonic to, instead of okay. So when composing, this is really to give you an additional vocabulary of chords that may be of interest to you when defining your chord progressions. I haven't gone into great detail about that because from an improvisational perspective, I think usually the chord progressions are going to be predetermined. And when you are a more advanced player, you may choose to deviate from those chords, and modal borrowing is one of the ways in which you can do that. But as a beginner targeted course, I think you're most likely to use this in your production and in your composition. So next time you're trying to make those chords, you might experiment using the voice motion method that I described of improvising them, but you might then also look at those chords. You might use your understanding of music theory to name those chords and think, that chord I could borrow from the mixer Lydian mode, and I could turn that major chord into a minor chord, or I could turn that minor chord into a major chord. And it may still be perfectly compatible with the melody that you already wrote, but it may move you towards a much more interesting sound that isn't just your standard fixed chord progressions that you hear all over the place, because there's definitely an inclination or a habit that you can develop of always playing the same chord progressions. So anyway, I think that's everything that I wanted to talk about today. I'd like to say thank you for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. I'd like to invite you to watch more of my videos, but in any case, above all, thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.